Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's fantastic presentation. It's something I've been waiting for. We are going to have with us Dr. Kavita Singh from JNU in Delhi, and it's really a talk that has its time. I'm going to let her talk more about it in a minute, but I'd like to just take a moment to introduce her. Kavita Singh is a professor at the School of Arts and Aesthetics of Jawaharlal Nehru University, where she teaches courses in the history of Indian painting, particularly the Mughal and Rajput schools, and the history and politics of museums. Kavita has published on secularism and religiosity. She's written about fraught national identities and the memorialization of difficult histories. We seem to be rife with those now as they relate to museums in South Asia and beyond. She's also published essays and monographs on aspects of Mughal and Rajput painting, particularly on style as a signifying system. In 2018, Kavita was awarded the Infosys Prize in Humanities and was elected to the prestigious American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2020. Well, that's a great beginning to this year. I'd like to take a moment to just thank Dr. Usha Balakrishnan for helping bring Kavita to us today and helping coordinate this a little bit. Kavita, if you'd like to just turn your video and your sound on, I'll take a moment and give a bit of a synopsis of what your talk will be about, and then you can just jump right in. So today we're going to be talking about Mughal painting. We know it's subtle, it's highly skilled, and sensitively rendered. And really what it does for us in so many ways is it opens a window into a world that we no longer have access to. Scholars have learned a great deal about Mughal, the Mughal people, the emperors, the noblemen, the servants, the workers, also objects. Furniture, daggers, wine cups, and of course, most famously, jewels. Many of these paintings include the depiction of women, that range from literary heroines like Laila or Shireen to historic persons like Noor Jahan or Hamida Banu, and working women, including laborers and midwives. Yet we know that many women in this time, most women, in fact, particularly of the elite class, lived in purdah and would not generally have been seen. And what we're really going to explore today is how Mughal artists tread a path between veiling and visibility in their depiction of women, and what form can we really sort of classify voyeurism and visual pleasure to take in Mughal art. And finally, of course, which I think is really critical, and I know we have a lot of questions for it, is did women themselves exert control and agency over the terms of that visibility? And that's really what the talk is going to address. And Kavita, I'd like to just hand it over to you now to take it away.
Great, thanks. Thank you very much, Usha and Minal, for asking me to do this. And I want to also thank Aditi and Manu and the rest of the Saffron Art team who've put it together. And I particularly want to thank the audience for their patience, because we were supposed to do this 2 days ago and you've come back because we had to postpone. Yeah. So thank you so much for doing that. Before I jump into the talk, I just want to check if I'm audible and if the connection seems all right.
Yes, absolutely. It looks fantastic. You look great. We can hear you really well.
Okay, great. So, Mughal art is so very beautiful, and its study takes me every day in so many interesting directions that I really think I'm lucky that it is my day job to be looking at these gorgeous paintings. And I'm really happy to have an opportunity to share them and to share a little bit about the way we learn about these things with a larger audience. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity today. The topic of today, however, which is about the depiction of women in Mughal art, is actually a topic that is quite complicated, and it raises a lot of very thorny questions. Because as you know, the purpose of painting is to make something visible. And when we look back on the Mughal period, we do depend very heavily on Mughal paintings to render for us the features of many things of that age. So we expect paintings to tell us quite reliably how the emperor looked, or how his palace was decorated, or what the courtiers were wearing. But the depiction of Mughal women actually seems at the very outset to be a paradoxical issue, because if, as is commonly believed, Mughal women live behind purdah, then the very act of depicting women would seem to go against the social norms. Just as you have in this painting a depiction of Akbar's mother traveling by boat, and you can't see her because she's somewhere behind all of these curtains. Mughal women were not supposed to be visible in society. So they're not supposed to be seen. And yet, when we look at Mughal paintings, we do see them depicted. So, since they are depicted, what can we learn about them from what we see? And more importantly, what can we trust in what we see? If the Mughal artist has to tread this difficult path between giving visibility to women because the painting that he's painting demands it, and yet the social norms tell him that he should not be doing it, how does he tread this difficult path between veiling and visibility? And what was the place for visual pleasure then, when seeing was actually something that was prohibited? What was the place for visual pleasure? When did this shade off into voyeurism? I'm not going to be able to answer these questions in any kind of definitive way, but please join me as I try to explore some of these themes. And let me start by saying at the outset that in Mughal times, as we have now, living in purdah would have been a luxury that was available only to a certain class of people. For the laboring classes, whom we see in this painting of the construction of the Agra fort, even for the women, there was hardly any option of staying at home and being behind the curtain. We're seeing women laborers working side by side with men at this building site. We're seeing them crushing stones, we're seeing them sifting lime. And we can see how there was no question of them protecting or veiling their modesty in order to preserve some imaginary honor of their families. The costumes that three of these women wear, these two and this one, I think are very familiar to us in India today, because it immediately identifies them as members of a nomadic pastoral community like the Rebaris of today. But apart from the moments when we see women being depicted working at construction sites, sometimes laboring in the fields, or quite often actually when we see them as characters who do the brewing and selling of wine, as we see in this page from the Hamzanama, where you have this woman who is tending to the distillery that's distilling wine, or even in this margin, which is so beautifully decorating the margin of a page of poetry from the famous Gulshan album, which is in Tehran. Occasionally, you will see women at work, but overwhelmingly, the Mughal world as it is depicted is a very masculine one. And certainly in the depiction of elite life at court or in the royal circles, the image of women is seen only in relation to certain themes at certain times. Nowadays, we have a growing number of scholars who take an interest in Mughal painting, and they try to see how they can use this as a source of historical information. And it's really wonderful because the way in which we art historians look at paintings is constantly being enriched by the perspectives that are brought by people who study social history, or who study the history of music, or the history of medicine, for instance. But as much as the paintings made in Mughal times reflect social history, they reflect the concepts, the social structures, the relations of the society that produced them. They are also embedded in a history of image making. And it's not just social contexts that are producing the paintings, but sometimes it is paintings that are producing paintings. Think about it. A young artist would enter the workshop and would learn to make a painting by copying earlier artworks. So they'll be inheriting a certain kind of training in how to draw a figure, how to pick colors, how to populate a composition. They won't be directly reflecting the world that they see around them so much. And when the artist becomes mature and is able to innovate and bring something fresh and original to the work that he does, he's not innovating from a void. He's innovating from something that has been inculcated in him. So just as we understand that a literary tradition will produce certain norms or certain protocols which will define the kind of utterance that is possible. You can have love poems in every language and every age, but a modernist love poem will sound very different from a ghazal, which is about love, for instance. Similarly, the painterly lineages also kind of lay out templates for the artists. So today, when I invite you to look at Mughal paintings with me and to look at paintings that depict female figures, I invite you to look at them not just as a window that gives us a thrilling glimpse into Mughal history or Mughal society as it was, but also as a window into Mughal painting and the kinds of norms, the kinds of stylizations that it follows. The paintings are not just showing us what Mughal life was like, but it's also creating a certain stylized image of what Mughal life should have been like. So let's begin with this painting from the Padshah-nama, which is this famous manuscript of the account of Shah Jahan's life. And the painting we are looking now is showing a moment from the processes of the wedding of Shah Jahan's favorite son, Dara Shikoh. At the upper level, we are seeing the high terrace where Shah Jahan is seated in his palace in Agra. He's under a beautiful canopy. In the distance, we see a forest of fireworks. And Dara is approaching his father, who is about to tie on his face a sehra. This is the sehra bandi ceremony before the barat. And he's tying on Dara's face a sehra that is made of very precious pearls. Below them on the ground, there is music and there is dancing that is part of the celebration. And when we look at the dancers, we see that they are women, and it seems to be a very animated group of very many different women. But as we go closer to the group, and we look at the men who are standing on the right, and then we look at the women who are dancing on the left, we see that the men are extremely individualized. Each face is different. But the women, who had seemed at first to be very diverse, are actually the same figure and the same face that are repeated again and again, just with their gestures at different angles, the heads tilted differently, and their skin tone is colored in different kinds of shades. So the artist seems to be showing us in this painting real faces of the real men who served at Shah Jahan's court. But for the women, he is reusing one type of a lovely girl. When we come upon stylization like this, our default option is that the artist had to take recourse to this kind of stylization because he had no option. He had to do this because of the rules of purdah, due to which he would never have actually seen any of the women in the royal circles. Maybe it's true that he wouldn't have seen women in the royal circles, but that definitely would not have applied to these women who are professional entertainers. And it's their entire professional role to be seen. They would not have been passing their life behind purdah. So in the case of women that the artist can see, the artist is still taking recourse to stylization. Why does the artist do this? What we're seeing here is a relatively late stage of Mughal painting, when artists have developed the skill of portraiture to a great extent. And the contrast in the individuation of the faces of the men and the stylization or the generalization of the faces of the women becomes very starkly clear. But even in the earlier days, when the skills of portraiture were not developed to this extent, as in this Akbarnama, which was made 40 years before the Pachahnama painting, at least, we see that the artists, even when they are not able to make such good portraits, are striving for exactly the same effect. This is a painting of a celebration at another wedding. And here again, there are dancers and musicians. And again, when we see the details, we see that already in this relatively early stage of Mughal painting, the men are differentiated much more than the women. The artist is not so skilled in portraiture, but at least he's tried to make the men appear different from each other. But the women, if you look at them, they all have squarish heads. See how the tops of their heads are almost like flat lines? And they all have the same kind of body, which has large breasts and a tiny little pinched waist. And then the hips flare out again. They all wear transparent ornis. And as unlikely as it first seems when we look at this painting in this Akbari page, this kind of female figure is actually based on the way earlier pre-Mughal traditions of painting that were present in India before the Mughals came had tended to depict female figures. The painting that we are looking at now comes from a Bhagavad Puran manuscript, but it's painted in a style that's called a Chaurapanchashika style, named after the most famous manuscript that is painted in this style. It's a particular kind of idiom which is highly stylized, but it has a lively formula for the depiction of female figures who have, again, square heads, transparent ornis, long plaits, and pinched waists and voluptuous bodies, which flare out above and below this waist. So if you look, unlikely as it seems at first glance, you realize that there is a certain formula which is underlying the paintings of these women in the Akbari paintings that is actually inherited from pre-Mughal paintings of a very different kind. Why does this happen? When the Mughal atelier was established under Akbar, it hired dozens of artists who painted in this pre-Mughal tradition in India, and they were set under the supervision of the Persian masters who had been brought to head the painting workshop. As these artists trained under the Persian masters, their visual language was gradually upgraded to become something that would fit in with the refined Persianate tradition. But there were places where some echo of this ancestral language remained in Mughal painting, and it remained particularly visible in the depiction of women. And I think even though the style is very softened and naturalized, you can see some underlying presence of the Chaurapanchashika style. And you see it even in this fantastic painting from the famous Hamzanama, this major project that is undertaken by Akbar's atelier, which has all these adventure stories, where in this page we see this fearless female character called Khosh Khiram, who has beheaded a spy. And you get a sense of the Chaurapanchashika figure, which is underlying the portrayal of Khosh Khiram as well. Now, the reason for the preference to hang on to the Chaurapanchashika kind of figure when you are making female figures will become clear when we recall that the masters who were in charge of Akbar's workshop had come from Persia. And if we cast a glance back at what Persian paintings were like, we see that the overall compositions that they had were really sophisticated, and they were really elegant, and they were really detailed. But the human figures that they made answered to the ideals of beauty as described in Persian poetry. So the bodies were slender like cypress trees, and the faces were as round and beautiful as the moon. And this kind of round moon face on the cypress tree body produced a stylization of the human figure that a less sympathetic scholar has actually called the lollipop on a stick look. When you look at human figures in these Persian paintings, sometimes it is even hard to tell whether you are looking at a male figure or a female figure unless the male figure has a beard. Therefore, it's small wonder to my mind that when Mughal painting developed its vocabulary, it looked to these Indic traditions for the way female figures were depicted, because it allowed them to modulate it and create a more voluptuous type. Over a period of time, the style of Mughal painting changed, and it became increasingly sophisticated and much more subtle. But one thing remained constant. When women were to be depicted, there was a formula for that. It might be a different formula at a different decade or a different stage, but it is a formula all the same. In Jahangir's type, a certain type emerges for female figures, which moves away from the Chaurapanchashika look. And it adopts for women a much more naturalistic look. And this kind of look that is developed in Jahangir's time becomes the dominant type for female figures, which continues through Shah Jahan's age and into the 18th century and even beyond. In these figures, the faces are very gently shaded. The angles are not at all harsh. There is more variety in the clothes. But the fact remains that it is a formula all the same that is used to construct these female figures. All the women are slim and young. They all have these cinched little waists. They all have long black plaits. They have heavy eyebrows. They have doe eyes, and they have rosebud mouths. So here is a famous painting of Jahangir during the holy celebrations in his harem. And you can see him right at the back of the painting. He's tottering on the arms of two women who are supporting him and taking him to the divan where he's going to lie down. Probably he's imbibed too much bhang, but the women around him are still making merry. And even in this crowd, which is so animated of these women, where every face is shown from a different angle, I think it still is the same face that is shown again and again. Now, this application of a formula for the depiction of women is something that is repeated across paintings from the time of Jahangir through to Shah Jahan. So you have this very odd phenomenon of having an album that is made on the orders of Dara Shikoh to be given as a wedding gift when he marries a lady called Nadira Banu. It's his gift to his bride. And in this album, you have paintings that are presented as though they were individual portraits of real historical figures, like Dara Shikoh's own sister, Jahanara, whom we are seeing on the right, and even Nadira Banu himself, the recipient of this album, whom we are seeing on the left. But even though these are supposed to be real living women of the time who are going to be the audiences for these paintings themselves, so they're going to be looking at these paintings and trying to find themselves in the paintings, even then, these faces and figures of these female bodies conform to very much the same type of a beautiful, young, but ultimately anonymous woman.
Kavita, sorry, we lost you for...
Oh, I'm sorry. How much should I backtrack, Ninal? Am I not audible? Hello?
Frozen a bit, unfortunately. Can you...
Sorry.
No problem at all. It happens. So you can go back to sharing.
How much should I backtrack?
So just where you were comparing the portraits and the idea of kind of that formulaic application, even when the portrait was representing a known figure, a known entity of historical importance. The one of Nadira Banu.
Okay. I hope the connection will be better. If it doesn't go well, again, tell me and I'll go to another room.
No problem. No problem. I'm going to turn my video off now.
Okay, here we are. Okay, so I was saying that there was an album that Dara Shikoh got made as a wedding gift when he married a lady called Nadira Banu. And the irony is that even in that album, you have some pages that are dedicated to the portrayal of real living women of that time who would have been from the circle of Dara Shikoh. So here on the right-hand side, you have a portrait that is identified as the portrait of Jahanara, Dara's sister. And on the left, you have Nadira Banu, who is herself the recipient of this album. She's the person for whom the album is made. And you can imagine that ladies like these would be holding the albums in their hands and seeking to see themselves in them. And yet, when they look at these paintings, what they see are the same type of a beautiful, young, and anonymous woman, rather than a depiction that actually attends to their individual selves. This same stylization of the woman happens in a series of betrothal portraits, which are meant to celebrate the engagements or the weddings of certain princes, where they are shown with their betrothed. And in paintings like these, sometimes it becomes very hard to tell the princess apart from the maids. Here is one such painting, which shows Jahangir's son, Prince Parvez, with his wife. And here's another painting, which again shows Dara Shikoh with his wife. And if you look at the detail on the right that I've put here, and you compare the face of the bride with the maid who's waving a fly whisk above her head, I think it would be very hard put to tell the difference between the two faces. It's as though once a formula has developed for what a beautiful woman looks like, then there is no reason to deviate from this norm. And the same figures, the same features are repeated again and again and again. Now, there's a wonderful essay by the scholar Molly Aitken called Purdah and Portrayal, which discusses this. And Molly Aitken identifies this kind of stylization as a way for the artist to show the woman without exposing her. So the stylization actually functions as a discrete kind of veil that is drawn over the living woman's face. Not only that, but in this article, Aitken also shows that in contrast to our contemporary view that this kind of depiction would objectify the woman, it would rob her of her selfhood. In this essay, Aitken shows us how some such paintings were patronized by the women themselves. And they were given by the women to their husbands as keepsakes to remember them by. So the female patrons of these paintings were also actually fine with being remembered, not by their individual faces and features, but to be remembered as the trope of a perfectly lovely woman. I suppose a little bit like our filters and photoshops today, where we try to make ourselves look better than we are, and we are happy to be represented as such. Now, this insistence in Mughal painting on stylization actually leads us to some situations that are really ironic sometimes, because here is a painting from the Akbarnama, which shows an event from Akbar's early childhood, and it is all about recognizing a particular woman. Many of you would know about how when Akbar was born, his father Humayun was politically in very dire straits. He'd lost his kingdom and he was wandering from place to place looking for some kind of support to win his kingdom back. So when he was about a year old, Akbar's parents embarked on the difficult journey to Iran to seek support from the Shah there. And they didn't think it was right to take their son with them. So they left Akbar in the care of an uncle in Kabul. And they returned 4 years later. Akbar now was seeing parents that he hadn't seen since he was a little infant. And he was first presented to his father, who greeted him and gave him affection and all of that. But then when he was taken to his mother, Humayun deliberately set up a little kind of test for Akbar, where he got Akbar's mother to sit with the whole group of women and to not come forward. And they wanted to see whether Akbar on his own, without any prompting, would recognize who his mother was. And of course he did. Unerringly, he walked straight to his mother and he sat in her lap. And this is something that is hailed in the Akbarnama and taken as a very early proof of how precocious Akbar was and how sharp his perceptions were. But in this picture, which is all about making visual distinctions between one individual woman and all the other women, again, all the women are depicted in a way where they are practically identical with each other. And so it seems particularly ironic that because of whatever conventions and niceties have been developed in the way painting addresses this problem of depicting women who should be veiled, it's really ironic that this same kind of stylization should still be applied. In the Akbarnama and later in the Jahangirnama, which were great illustrated manuscripts that were made to record the reign of Akbar or Jahangir, we also find a number of paintings that mark what was probably the most significant moment in the life of a queen when she managed to give birth to an heir. And there is a fantastic painting that shows the birth of Jahangir, which was made to illustrate the Jahangirnama. And it was made by the artist Bishan Das, who was accepted to be the greatest portrait painter of Jahangir's time. For those who are interested in the depiction of women in Mughal art, this painting is pure gold because it takes us into the women's quarters and it regales us with a wealth of details of the kinds of events and objects that would have been present, at the time of the birth of an heir. And it allows us to see so many people from within this very sequestered space of the harem. Right in the foreground of the painting, and we're seeing a detail of the lower half. So right in the foreground of the painting, we have a group of men sitting on a carpet who are the astrologers. Casting the horoscope of the newly born child was a very important thing. It had to be done right away. And there is a very authoritative looking woman who is standing near the astrologers. And probably she's telling them about the exact time that the child was born so that they can make their calculations. Purdah doesn't seem to apply to this woman, maybe because she looks like an older woman, maybe because perhaps she's a midwife, so she belongs to the working class. And you can see that other women are not so unconstrained and they are standing either behind that red kanat or they are peeping over it, but not willing to come out from its shelter. The upper half of this painting is even more thrilling for us to see because it seems to give us unparalleled access into the world of Mughal royal women. And we can see on the left-hand side, there's a cluster of women, most of whom seem to be attendants, servants, musicians who are celebrated. And on the other side, we see what is likely to be a more elite crowd, princesses, members of the royal family. Inside the room, we see the mother who has just given birth and she's been clad with a golden diadem. She has even a golden shawl wrapped around her, probably rich clothes that have just been put on her after the birth as a kind of gift. There is a maid, perhaps a wet nurse, who is holding the little baby in her arms. There's a cute little bejeweled cradle next to her. And sitting just outside the room, you have a very grand looking lady wearing golden and silver clothes, and she's sitting on a golden and bejeweled chair. So if this painting is showing us the birth of Jahangir, then some of the characters would be easy to identify. Jahangir's mother was a Rajput princess from Amber, Jaipur, and that would be the lady who is recumbent. And Jahangir's grandmother was Hamida Banu Begum, a lady of Persian extraction. And she is probably the person who is sitting on that bejeweled chair, very authoritatively with her feet resting on a cushion, just outside the room where the birth has taken place. Now we see how the grandmother, Hamida Banu, is painted fair-skinned. We see how the mother has duskier tones, and it seems to make sense also that one is a Rajput, one is an Iranian, and we feel that, my goodness, we are really seeing individual faces. We are seeing a eyewitness account of some of the most important women from the Mughal royal family, finally here in this painting, where the artist seems to have unprecedented access. But we have to rein in our excitement, I'm afraid, because the fact is that the birth of Jahangir took place in 1569, and this painting is made almost 50 years after the event. And so we very regretfully have to realize that when the artist is individuating faces, he is doing it on the basis of people he might know, he has seen around him from his daily life, and he is making conjectural images, almost like a guessing game, where he is using his perceptions to capture not the appearance of real historical women, but to populate this scene with women who are very likely to be close to the types of women that these historical figures were. Many years before Jahangir's artist made this scene of Jahangir's birth, Akbar's artists had already recorded this moment in the Akbarnama. And here in this slide, we have paintings that show the birth scenes of two of Akbar's sons that were made for the Akbarnama's illustrated version. On the left, we're seeing the scene of the birth of Salim, who is the future Jahangir. And on the right, we are seeing the painting of the birth of his second son, Murad. Now, are these paintings any more credible, any more believable and reliable because they are made closer to the time of the event itself? There are differences in details, but both of these paintings have some things in common in the way they are composed. In the uppermost register, we see the background where there is a curtained chamber in which the mother has just given birth. We see below that nurses who are tending to the baby or who are making pastes and unguents. We see celebrations in the courtyard outside. And then we see the wall which separates the harem from the street. And on the street, you have more music, you have beggars coming, you have a hubbub that would obviously accompany an important event like the birth of a royal prince. If we move closer to the scene of Salim's birth, we see that there are little details that seem to give us a lot of local color. There's a peacock on the terrace. There are shehnais in the courtyard. There are thals that are full of sweets that are being passed around. And all of this suggests that even if the style of the artist is not as naturalistic as Jahangir's artist's style was, this is still a scene that is based on very close observation. These details of the peacock and the thal and the shehnai are indeed taken from daily life, but I think the composition as a whole takes its cue from something else altogether. Now, you may be aware that there were European prints that came into the Mughal court through various kinds of travelers, particularly missionaries, who had been in contact with the Mughals since the 1570s. And you may know that Akbar actually invited Portuguese Catholic priests from Goa to come to Fatehpur Sikri and live there so that they could participate in the interreligious debates that he used to host. These and other subsequent European visitors brought a lot of paintings, prints, and illustrated books with them from Renaissance Europe. And these created a sensation at court. Among the scenes that came, there must have been prints of the birth of the Virgin Mary. And I think it is this theme and the way it's depicted in these prints that provides the appropriate reference to depict the birth of a special person when Mughal painting takes this theme up. In many depictions that are made in Europe of the scene of the birth of the Virgin, we see the mother who has just given birth still lying in bed. She is usually in a bed that is draped with elaborate curtains. The baby has been taken into the arms of a nursemaid who is giving her a bath or helping to feed her. And all around, there are very busy preparations to take care of the mother and child. So when you compare the formula of this with what is depicted in the Akbarnama scene, you see that the artist has translated this formula from Europe into his local context. But some basic ideas about the composition certainly were sparked off by these scenes of the birth of Virgin Mary. The artist takes it from there and he improvises and adds his own observations and details. The likelihood that this biblical birth scene provided a framework for Mughal birth scenes, I think, can be gauged from paintings like the one we are now seeing on the left, which is a Mughal copy of the engraving that we just saw on the right. In fact, there are multiple versions made by Mughal artists of this theme over several decades. And we see that this theme had an enduring interest for the artists. Missionaries who brought these paintings and prints to the Mughal court were very flattered by the attention that they garnered. You can see how the prints themselves were assiduously collected by the Mughal atelier and how they were pasted into album pages where they were embedded with calligraphy and decorated with these gorgeous margins. Now, the missionaries thought that the interest that these prints were provoking was going to actually draw the Mughals towards Christianity, and perhaps the emperor or one of his sons would even convert and become a Catholic himself. But instead, in the end, it turns out that it was a fascination with the image rather than with the religious context of the images that created them that impelled the interest of the Mughals. The prints were heavily collected. They got pasted into albums of the kinds we see over here. And the stray European artist who also came to the missions of the Jesuits was also corralled and taken off to the Mughal court and was made to make works that were pasted into Mughal albums themselves. But by far the largest corpus of such images comes from prints that were cheap, plentiful in Europe, and therefore very easy to transport and circulate. And you have then in Mughal India, artists poring over these prints and making many, many copies of them or versions of them. And you see the enthusiasm of the Mughal artists to probe this new visual language. We see the kind of skill and the kind of care with which they respond to these incoming images. And one of the most popular themes to be collected and to be copied and translated into the Mughal idiom is the theme of the Virgin Mary with Jesus as a child. I'm going to show you just a smattering of the dozens of images of the Virgin Mary and child that the Mughals collected and that the Mughal artists made. Here in this slide on the right, we are seeing a print by the famous artist Dürer, and we are seeing two different versions on the left that were made by Mughal artists. We are seeing three different source prints converted into three different kinds of Mughal paintings here, but all of the same theme. Two more in this slide, and more. And it goes on. So you can imagine that the sheer presence of such paintings of the Virgin Mary would make it quite understandable why we should also end up with a painting of Jahangir holding a small copy of a Madonna image, which would have been like one of these little paintings that we see here. So he's holding a copy of a Madonna image and looking attentively at it because these paintings were very plentifully available. Now, some scholars have even suggested that this painting of Jahangir holding a picture of the Madonna should be seen as a companion image to another very well-known painting of Jahangir, which shows Jahangir holding a portrait of Akbar some years after Akbar has passed away. And if we juxtapose these two and look at them together, we could say that in one painting, Jahangir is holding an image of his actual father, and in the other painting, he is holding an image of his archetypal mother. And in this case, replacing a portrait of his real mother with a portrait of the Virgin Mary becomes one more instance of depicting a Mughal lady without really showing her, by drawing a discrete veil over the real appearance of Jahangir's mother and substituting an archetypal mother who can suggest her good qualities and her virtues without revealing her face. This idea of Mary seems to have taken a special hold over Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan. Again, the Jesuits thought that this was a very good sign and that the Mughals were coming under the spell of the Madonna and they were just about to convert to Christianity, but this was an error. For one thing, Mary is already a revered figure within the traditions of Islam. So paying respect to her doesn't have to mean that you are disaffected with the faith of Islam. But there was another very special reason for the Mughals to want to invoke Mary as the symbol of the archetypal mother. The Mughals were very proud of their lineage, and they traced their lineage back to two great conquerors of Upper Asia, to Timur and to Genghis Khan. But 10 generations before Genghis Khan, in the Mughal lineage, there is a mythical ancestress called Alankua, whose 5 sons become the founders of the 5 Mongol clans. And 3 of her 5 sons are born after her husband dies. And she declares that she has been impregnated by a mysterious being that came into her tent opening riding on a shaft of light. So she was pierced by this creature that is made of light, and she bore children as a consequence of that. Now, Alankua's story of this kind of virgin birth, or if not virgin birth, chaste birth through a shaft of light, has an obvious analogy to Mary's conception and Mary's virgin birth. And Akbar's great biographer, Abul Fazl, says that the Mughal line is filled with a divine radiance which had come into Alankua's womb. And then it had passed through all the subsequent generations, where sometimes the light was visible, sometimes in the case of a less worthy successor, it was obscured, but the light was there. And in the person of Akbar, of course, the light comes into its fullest and highest radiance. Not only was the memory of Alankua very vividly alive for the Mughals, but in Akbar's time, this conflation of this chaste birth through the ancestress gets conflated with the idea of Mary in a very obvious way, because Akbar renames the significant mothers in his life as Marys. We know his mother was Hamida Banu Begum, but Akbar starts referring to her as Maryam Makani, or the Mary of the palace. And Harka Bai, who is a Rajput princess, who is the mother of the crown prince, her name we think is Harka Bai, but he refers to her as Maryam Us Zamani, or the Mary of this age. So this conflation of all the royal wives and mothers with Mary does something very interesting to a number of public events like the grand darbars that seem at first glance to be entirely masculine. If we look at this painting of the Darbar of Jahangir, where he is receiving his son Parvez, as he looks down favorably upon his son, so does the Virgin Mary. And I hope you can see the little detail that I've circled over here, which is painted into the wall as though it was a fresco, but I feel that she is there as a kind of participant in the scene where you have exclusively male courtiers and you have the presence of the mother who is able to take pride in her son's achievements. In the great Padshah-nama, when Shah Jahan's artists are recounting the early successes that Shah Jahan had when he was still a prince, and when he comes to report these successes to his father, he is in this painting telling his father about a big military victory that he's won, and he's getting a fantastic jewel as a reward. And again, you have Mary as a witness to the moment. I hope you can see her figure almost directly above Shah Jahan's head. And so also in this other moment also from the Pachanama, when again Shah Jahan, who is known as the Prince Khurram at that point, has again done something good, and he's reporting to his father, and his father gives him permission to come close and to embrace him. We see a detail in which both Christ and Mary seem to be taking a personal delight in the success of Shah Jahan. So I feel a little pity for the Jesuits who misunderstood this prominence of Catholic imagery in Mughal palaces, and who didn't realize that when Mary was being used, she was incorporated into Mughal myth making. Now, if Mary is being appropriated as the Mughal mother, then the Mughal emperors are no less than Jesus in themselves. And there is actually a very interesting paper by a scholar called Asfar Moin, which explains that this identification with Jesus is actually cultivated by the Mughal emperors on several counts, because it allows them to be able to assert that they have something special or some kind of quasi-divine quality within them, without getting into conflict with the claims to divinity that are being made by the other great Mughal Muslim emperors, that is the Safavids in Iran, who claim that they are infused with some kind of spiritual greatness because they are descended from a line of Sufis. And then you have the Ottomans, who actually are the caliphs. So they are the caliphs, and they have a tremendous power over Orthodox Islam. So this analogy of Mary and Jesus actually allows the Mughals to stake a separate kind of lineage in which they can claim greatness and quasi-divinity. In that context, it becomes amusing to see this double page from an album in which Jahangir on the right is actually facing or almost confronting an Ottoman emperor on the left. And again, in his claims to superiority, notice that he has a halo, the Ottoman does not. Mary seems to be aiding and abetting the claim to divine status, because she's present here as well, but in a way that the Jesuits would not have liked, because she is drawn onto the little wine cup that Jahangir is holding. But let's return now to the real living and breathing women of the Mughal family. It's all very well to see how Mughal women are typecast as anonymous beauties, or they are all turned into virtuous virgin mothers. But one of the things that has really frustrated scholars about the lack of any true portraits of Mughal women is the evidence that we have that there were women artists in Mughal times. If male painters were not allowed into the zenana, we can understand this. But if there were women painters, why didn't they leave us with likenesses of the time? Now, in this slide, we are looking at a fictional image, an image that is illustrating a story, which has a princess making a self-portrait, and this self-portrait will be publicized, and suitors will be invited, and they will have to fulfill certain challenges to be able to win her hand. But the artist, when he has all the different events of the story to choose from, chooses to depict this woman where the princess is making a portrait of herself. And the way she's sitting and looking attentively, the way somebody is holding up a mirror for her, the kind of pen stand that she has on the carpet in front of her, all of this kind of suggests that the artist was familiar with the idea of female artists at the time. We even have this image from Shah Jahan's time, which seems to be like a documentary image, which is actually showing a young woman artist sketching a live portrait of somebody who is posing in front of her. So the question is, where are the drawings that female artists would have made? We don't know where the drawings are, which might have been sketches that they made of each other or of other inhabitants of the zenana, but we do know about some paintings that are by women artists. Unfortunately, a lot of the really interesting ones are in a famous album called Gulshan album, which is in the Gulshan Library in Tehran. It hasn't been completely published. Scholars haven't had easy access to it. So it's a bit frustrating because you know that there are all kinds of wonderful things locked up in that. But in this page, the drawing at lower right of a river god, which is obviously copied very skillfully from an engraving, is inscribed as being the work of an artist called Ruqayya Banu. Now that's a woman's name, Ruqayya Banu. One of the paintings in this page is ascribed to Nadira Banu. And she calls herself Nadira Banu, the pupil of Aka Riza. And Aka Riza was this male painter who was the most important artist in service of Jahangir when he was still a prince. And in this painting, which is also from the Gulshan album, we have an inscription telling us that it's by, again, another female name. It is by Sahifa Banu. And this is actually a copy or a version of a painting that we are seeing on the right-hand side, which was by this legendary artist Behzad from the 15th century, whom everybody looked up to. They felt that he had innovated and broken new ground in the art of painting. So Sahifa Banu is actually trying her hand at making a painting of Behzad, and yet she's not overwhelmed by the fact that she's making a painting after a master, because she's adding her own details. So she's added that sun, she's added details in the sky, and she's added a few figures on the side of the building as though they are watching and supervising the construction of this castle that the rest of the people are engaged in. There's also another painting that is attributed to Sahifa Banu, which shows one of the Shahs of Iran. So, two paintings by Sahifa Banu that we know of. But most interesting for me, among the paintings that have the inscriptions that tell us that they are by women painters, is this one, which is ascribed to an artist called Nini. It's a copy of a print, which we see on the left-hand side, which is about the martyrdom of Saint Cecilia. Saint Cecilia was an early Christian martyr. She was the patron saint of musicians. And she was living in Roman times, and as a Christian, she was hauled up, she was ordered to be beheaded. And the executioner actually tried thrice to cut her neck, and thrice he was unsuccessful. So he gave up and left her. And she lingered on in life for 3 more days, where she slowly bled to death, tended by other women companions from among the Christian fold. Now, one can only imagine the allure of this character, a character who defied authority, who boldly faced death, the pathos of her passing, the way in which other women form a community of care around her. You can imagine how this would appeal to a talented and able woman who was confined to her home. Nini's version, if you look at it, softens the axe marks on Cecilia's neck, which are very prominent in the print. And the concern of the women who tend to her, I think, is perhaps meant to evoke the solidarities across women that was in the Zenana. Now, this business of cloaking women in stereotypes, where they are anonymous beauties or virgin mothers, does place a veil of visibility over them. But powerful and important women were not entirely invisible. Even if their faces weren't always seen, scholars tell us about the kind of power that was wielded by them, even apart from that extraordinary figure of Noor Jahan, whom I'll turn to in a moment. And even as most prominent women lived out their lives, possibly traveling in carriages that were covered with curtains or living in palaces behind high walls, their presence could still be marked in the city in very powerful and prominent ways. And you could argue that there is a sense in which the Taj Mahal actually makes Mumtaz visible. We may not see the image of her face, but the idea of her, her beauty, her qualities, the love she inspired, they become present in the minds of every citizen who lives in Agra. By that token, Humayun's tomb or to be making visible for us Humayun's first wife, Haji Begum, because she supervised the tomb project and she's believed to be responsible for many of its characteristics and even some of the money that went into its building. So it is her project and it is known to be her project. So surely she is claiming a space and visibility within that space, and she is becoming renowned and her name is on the lips of people. You have Noor Jahan, who also becomes hypervisible through many architectural projects that she patronizes. You have the fantastic and path-breaking architecture of Itmaduddola's tomb, which we are seeing on this slide now, the tomb that she had built for her parents. You also had other architectural commissions by her, a famous sarai near Jalandhar at Noor Mahal, Jahangir's tomb in Lahore, for example. All of these would make her very present in the urban space. And when Shah Jahanabad was built, then you had ambitious architectural commissions by Jahanara, Shah Jahan's beloved daughter, including the Baghi Begum that we're seeing here, which occupied a huge tract of land just off the main thoroughfare of Chandni Chowk. So here is the palace. Here is the main thoroughfare of Shah Jahanabad, and occupying this entire area, you have the Bagh Begum, which is built and endowed by Jahanara. Elsewhere, you have the Bagh, which is endowed by Roshanara, her sister, and you have the mosques that are made by wives of Shah Jahan, Fatehpuri Begum, Akbarabadi Begum. Later, you have a big garden called Qudsiya Bagh, built by Qudsiya Begum. All of these are architectural and urban landmarks. And these very wealthy and powerful women actually reshaped the city through the buildings and the gardens that bore their names and took the awareness of their presence and their power and their wealth far beyond the palace walls behind which they lived. So these architectural commissions actually make women present in public without being visible. And the buildings that they commission and the paintings that women artists make me think also of the number of women poets whose poems were known. We know that Aurangzeb's daughter Zebu-Nisa was an acclaimed poet, and she took as her pen name Makhfi. And the word Makhfi means concealed, the one who is hidden. But the same pen name of Makhfi was also adopted by multiple other royal women who were poets, including Salima Sultan, who was a wife of Akbar's, and by Noor Jahan, the wife of Jahangir. And literary circles seem to have circulated these poems widely, and the authorship that lay behind the pen name also seems to have been known. So you know that this is a poem of Makhfi, but Salima Sultan Makhfi or Noor Jahan Makhfi. So which verses are by Noor Jahan writing as Makhfi, which are by Zebu-Nisa as Makhfi? All of this is known. And so we have to ask ourselves that by taking the pen name of the concealed or the hidden one, what is actually being hidden and what is being carried forth? And so I think we need to have a different category for this kind of presence of Mughal women, which is both a very visible presence and is also a veiled presence. Their presence is, I think, a bit like the presence of women in this painting, which is a famous painting painted very early in Jahangir's reign to show the darbar that was held to celebrate the first Nowruz ceremony that occurred after Jahangir came to the throne. When we look at this painting again, it looks like an exclusively masculine gathering, where we are seeing an enthroned Jahangir at the center over here, surrounded by male courtiers and sons and servants. But this painting changed irrevocably for me when I realized that these two red domed structures in the background are circular tents in which the women are seated, and they are looking on at the scene through the chicks that are hung across the entrances. And so if anything, the presence of these powerful women on the scene who are themselves unseen, but are seeing all, actually even come to have a slightly menacing aura for me, like the capacities of surveillance that these people are capable of carrying out. When this painting is made, we don't yet have present on the scene or in Jahangir's harem the most powerful of his wives, his 20th wife, Noor Jahan, whom Jahangir marries some 5 years after he ascends to the throne. We all know, I think, that as Jahangir aged and as his health declined, Noor Jahan actually took over the reins of empire. And she must have played a very important and a very public role. Because of her special status as this most beloved wife, and also as the de facto empress, it's conjectured that there are a number of paintings of a special looking woman from Jahangir's time, and that these paintings might show her. This one, for instance, is a tiny portrait. It's hardly 2 inches across. It was probably made to be worn on a locket close to the heart. And it probably shows Noor Jahan. In this painting, you have to look very closely to realize that this person who is loading a gun is not a man, but is a powerfully built woman who is wearing a turban. From her belt, we can see a powder horn hanging. Noor Jahan is meant to have been an expert marksman or markswoman, if you will. And this painting is probably meant to commemorate her skill in handling a gun, something that Jahangir mentions in the Jahangirnama. There is a painting, unusual, which shows Jahangir on a terrace embracing a woman, and they are flanked by 2 attendants who are painted much smaller in scale. The woman whom Jahangir is embracing matches him in size, and it's conjectured that this also shows Noor Jahan. And then we have this painting, which scholars have given a very touching interpretation to, telling us that this was a painting that was made shortly after Jahangir's death, and that it shows Noor Jahan holding Jahangir's portrait as though she is committed, even after he has died, she is committed to keeping his memory alive. And indeed she was, because she was the one who oversaw the construction of his mausoleum in Lahore. Now, across these paintings, the figure of Noor Jahan is not identical, but there is a kind of an internal consistency between these paintings. They all show a large, rather sturdily built woman. She has wide hips, she has a long nose, which is why it becomes a bit surprising to turn to the next painting, which shows a historical event connected with Noor Jahan, and therefore it definitely depicts her. And this is a painting which shows a banquet that she had hosted in honor of Jahangir's son Shah Jahan at a time when Shah Jahan was very unhappy with Noor Jahan. Noor Jahan had been playing politics against Shah Jahan. Shah Jahan had mounted a rebellion against Jahangir, but he was too important and too useful to Jahangir for this rebellion to go on, and the father had to make an approach to his son, and Noor Jahan had to show that she would no longer be working against Shah Jahan's interest. So she hosted a banquet and she gave him lavish gifts. So in the center of this painting, we're seeing Jahangir, of course, we're seeing Noor Jahan, and we're seeing Shah Jahan seated near them. But when we move closer, we see something odd about this. The portraits of Jahangir and Shah Jahan are consistent with the many portraits that we have seen in other paintings of these men. But the portrait of Noor Jahan over here makes her petite. It makes her a tiny little woman who looks like a pretty little teenager rather than the powerful woman that she was. And this image is strikingly inconsistent with all the other images that we believe are hers. Now, the images need not all have been portraits. They could also have been a type of image that the artist used to represent Noor Jahan. But the type that he has chosen is of a strong woman in all of the others, but not in the painting where she is making amends with Shah Jahan. Is it because in that painting she is making a public statement that she's going to step away from politics? She's going to let power pass from one man to another? And to reinforce this message, has the artist who so far has created the image of a very strong and dynamic woman decided to depict Noor Jahan almost as a little girl of no consequence. I don't know, but it's an interesting possibility. Now, a few years ago, the Smithsonian Institution brought this really intriguing object. When it's closed, it looks like a slim little book, but when it's opened, it reveals itself to be a mirror case. On the right-hand side is the mirror in which the holder would see his or her own face. And on the left, you see within an oval frame, the portrait of a beautiful woman. This portrait is now darkened with age because it was lacquered. But if we zoom into it and if we play with the contrast a little bit, I think it's easier to see. And we see that it is actually quite a startling image of a strikingly beautiful woman, bedecked with jewels, but whose torso is entirely nude. When we read the inscriptions that are written in gold on either side of the figure, we see that it was made by a Shah Jahani artist and it was made in the first year of Shah Jahan's reign. Now, there's a great scholar of Mughal painting called John Seiler, and he does a study of this and speculates on who it is who could have been portrayed in this way. The fact that you have a slightly downward tilting eye and a pointed nose suggests that the artist is trying to convey the image of a particular person, and he suggests that this is meant to be a portrait of none other than Mumtaz Mahal. So that whenever Shah Jahan used this mirror, his face would always be in the company of an image of his most beloved wife. But what's amazing about this is then to think, how and why would she be painted by an artist with a nude torso? To understand the presence of nude female torsos in Mughal paintings, I think we need to go back to the European prints that had come to the Mughal court and to look at a different category of prints than the ones we have been looking at so far. Because a lot of the prints that came also related to neoclassical subjects, to Greek and Roman mythology. And in them, a lot of the allegorical figures or the personifications of nature were in the form of figures that imitated classical statues. And in many cases, these classical statues, then, they were supposed to be these gods and goddesses, and they were nude or semi-nude with fluttering drapery. You're seeing on the left one of the frontispieces to a very famous Bible that the first set of Jesuits gave as a gift to Akbar. And you're seeing on the right an image painted by one of Akbar's most talented artists, Basavan. And he's probably playing with the idea of emblematic figures who are wearing clothes which still reveal their breasts, derived from, if not the image that we're seeing on the left over here, then certainly of a very similar type of image. The fact that there were many such images of these classical figures who were nude or semi-nude that were circulating in the Mughal realm is easy to see because of the number of such versions of these semi-clad female figures, these emblems that are seen in a lot of the Akbari drawings and paintings that are made after prints. So you can see that this way of making a female figure, which reveals part of her bodies, also is a vocabulary that is available to the Mughal artists, and it's something that has a tremendous impact, not just on the copies that they make of these prints, but also on their depiction of many beautiful Mughal women. And in fact, today or yesterday in the slides, we already saw a number of pictures in which very highly ranked women were depicted. And even when there were these anonymous beauties with these uniformly lovely faces, their bodies were clad in such thin muslin that their breasts could easily be seen. So the portrait of Mumtaz with her nude torso was not actually a unique instance, but it was on a variation on a theme that was routine, where the veil is drawn by the artist over the woman's face by making her an anonymous generalized, standard, beautiful woman, but the veil is equally lifted over her body, where we see her breasts very clearly, even if she is clad. The cladding is so thin that the eyes can penetrate the cloth. Why was it acceptable for an artist to do what to us appears like a kind of mental disrobing of a princess, so that anyone who is within the circle that would be allowed to see these paintings would be able to see and speculate on the breasts of a princess or a royal bride? Perhaps it's possible for the artist to do this because it's so well understood that these are not images of the actual princess or the queen, but it's a fantasy image which signals to how she is a perfect woman and is perfectly beautiful. But this use of these beautiful bodies that are totally visible to us, these perfect nude bodies on which these idealized faces are perched, it reminds me of a practice that was seen long ago in classical Roman statuary, where great generals would be honored with public statues, usually after their death, in which their very unlovely, aged, and wrinkled faces would be placed on bodies that were utterly perfect. To see such an image was not to invade the privacy of a general or an emperor. Rather, it was to see this general or this emperor now wearing the body of a god. So the body, actually, the perfect body, becomes also a kind of a mask, which is not meant to represent the actual body and the actual nudity of this particular Roman general or emperor, but just a sign of his perfection or his valor and his great qualities. And I think something very similar is intended over here. When protected by the stylization, the woman gets to be stripped of her garments, and yet, even though you're seeing so much, the actual woman who is denoted by these descriptions remains unseen. In later years in the 18th century, as the Mughal Empire crumbles, and as former mansabdars and former governors of provinces seize power for themselves, the images that would have once been the exclusive privilege of the Mughal court begin to be produced everywhere. And with this changed balance of power and this new context, the meaning of the images that are imitated and circulated also begin to change. The image of semi-nude ladies who are presented as Mughal ladies begins to proliferate, and many of them begin to get the label of Noor Jahan as they pop up in the courts of the former Mughal subordinates who have now become sovereigns in their own right. So you have Noor Jahan here produced in Kishankar and a Noor Jahan produced in Bikaner. She's wearing elaborate headgear and jewels, but her breasts are very clearly visible in these relatively stylized paintings that are produced at these Rajput courts. There are other paintings that show these lovely but anonymous Mughal ladies framed by a window. We see a rolled up curtain on top. We see a carpet draped on the railing at the bottom of the window, and this indicates the architectural setting through which these beauties are being glimpsed. But this framing in a window with the curtain and the carpet is actually taken from a very special kind of image that had earlier been developed as appropriate for showing the emperor alone. And this was the ritual of Jharoka Darshan, in which the emperor would show himself to assembled crowds twice a day at sunrise and sunset. This practice was connected to the belief that the Mughal emperor was a semi-divine character. He was filled with otherworldly radiance, and the sight of the emperor becomes akin to a darshan, a glimpsing of the deity in the temple. Now, when the ruler appeared at the window, and you're seeing on the left the actual architectural frame in which he would show himself to his people, and on the right you're seeing a depiction from Jahangir's time of a scene of such a Jharoka Darshan. So when this kind of thing actually happened, where the emperor presented himself, he would come and stand behind a window, and presumably the curtain would be dramatically whisked up to reveal the sight of him, and a soft carpet would have been draped over the balustrade, so that when the emperor leaned forward, he didn't have to touch the hard, cold marble of the railing, but would touch a soft fabric instead. And here is a detail of the same painting showing Jharoka Darshan by Jahangir, and two of his sons are also witnessing his Jharoka Darshan by standing on either side of him. Now, for favored courtiers who couldn't come to the palace for this ritual, the emperor might gift a Jharoka image of himself. And the person who received this image would be expected to look at it twice a day in place of the daily darshan, perhaps. But in the 18th century, this very solemn ceremony of darshan actually gets used where the same framework of a curtain above and a carpet below gets used to frame voyeuristic fantasies that these new audiences might have of the secret life of erotic pleasures that were going on in the Mughal harem, where the raised curtain now suggests to us a voyeuristic glimpse that we get of what's going on in the bedroom when the curtain is accidentally raised. Not only are there images of lone figures of the standing beauties that we saw a few minutes ago, but there are also images like this, in which we are actually seeing two women fondling each other. So the artist is serving up these images to stoke the imagination of what goes on in the harem, where all of these women are presumably locked up and are very sexually frustrated because the emperor has gone away. And notice how precisely in this image, the symbology of the Jharoka has been taken from the formal darshan image on the right-hand side and has been applied to this voyeuristic and titillating scene on the left. So let me end now with a final image, which I think expresses these kinds of voyeuristic and lascivious fantasies about what goes on in the Mughal harem. And this is a painting that is made again in the 18th century, but it is made in a Rajput kingdom that is just beginning to test its autonomy as Mughal power fades away. In Kishangarh, the court welcomed artists of the highest quality who had left the Mughal court to come to Delhi, had left the Mughal court in Delhi and come to other Rajput centers in search of new patronage. One of these artists from the Mughal court, Bhavani Das, was considered such a prize catch in Kishangarh that his salary was actually the highest salary paid to any employee by the court of Kishangarh. And in this painting, which is probably by him or by his famous follower Nihal Chand, we see a painting that is reprising what has become quite a routine scene by now of the pleasures in the evening, where on a beautiful marble terrace by the riverside in the imperial palace, the Mughal emperor retires for an evening of pleasure, listens to music, and probably engages in erotic pleasures as well. But this is a painting, the one on the right-hand side, which has been made specifically for Mughal eyes. And the artist makes an image of a Mughal world gone completely amok. In the apex of this scene, we see an aging, obese Mughal emperor who is drowsing in his cups. He is oblivious to everything that is going on around him, including the young woman who is sitting on his lap with her clothes unbuttoned, desperately trying to arouse him. She's even gripping his turban, which would be a stunning act of disrespect, but it is all to no avail. The ruler simply drowses on, unaware, impotent, unable to respond to this woman or to control the riot that is breaking out in the Zanana. In the crowd below, women claw and fight each other, or they fondle each other and they rub up against each other, having given up on anything coming from this man. Any ability to give or take pleasure, or any ability to exert control, or any ability even to be aware of his surroundings. It's significant to me that this painting is is dated by scholars to be from around 1740, because this was just 1 year after the extreme incompetence and the dithering of the Mughal emperor and his inability to control the warring noblemen in his court actually paved the way for Nadir Shah to sweep into Delhi with absolutely disastrous results. And here, as the artist shows us women's faces, bodies, appetites, and passions running rampant, we are seeing the depiction of a zenana where the women stand in for all kinds of ideas about the Mughal world at large. And you have the artist using images of zenana and women as metaphors for the falling away of Mughal imperial power, producing an image that is part lurid fantasy and part political cartoon. I'll end here. Thank you very much for your attention.